The following webinar was recorded as part of the original implementation of IWISH and has been made available for informational purposes only. Some portions of the original recording have been cut to ensure participants' privacy. References to the Lewin Group, implementation team, site liaisons, PHL, Google Drive, and some forms are not applicable to the demonstration extension effective October 1st, 2020. Terms and conditions of grantee's cooperative agreement supersede any information presented here. Please see the IWISH Operations Manual for the most up-to-date implementation information.
We want to be able to identify foundational concepts of teamwork. We want to be able to define strategies for cultivating interprofessionalism within IWISH. We also want to share some best practices for workplace communication and conflict resolution. And then finally, we want to explain and share some tips for debrief and feedback. As you may remember from our first presentation, teamwork is one of the fundamental components of this demonstration. Teamwork between the resident wellness director and the wellness nurse, between the resident and their family, between the property manager and supervisors. So it's really important that you pay attention during this presentation and take notes that you can use as you prepare to ramp up for this demonstration. Next slide. So to help you focus and think about what you want to take away, think about these two questions as you listen to the information. How will you use the teamwork concept discussed in your everyday interactions with your IWISH partners? And then two, which strategies or best practices will you and your IWISH partner practice in the next 2 weeks? So I know some of you guys have been wondering, what is it that we do until we get OMB clearance? It's begin to practice these tips and information that you'll learn today, and to continue to learn during these free in-person trainings. So now we're going to jump right into it. I'm going to turn it over to Michael and Debbie to briefly introduce themselves and begin talking to us about teamwork. Michael and Debbie?
Thank you, Joy. Good afternoon, everyone. Next slide, please. We are excited to be talking to you all today about the topics of teamwork and workplace communication. And as Joy mentioned, our objectives are to provide a conceptual foundation of teamwork and provide some suggestions, hopefully, that you can take back with you in your current role or as your role is developing this. Like I said, we're both excited to be a part of this. We're excited to be a part of the IWISH program. We have provided training on teamwork processes across a wide range of domains. And perhaps surprisingly, across this range of audiences, which has included anything from astronauts and physicians to college students, the challenges for teamwork processes are all similar. They're not the same, but they're similar, just different across, in some ways, contextually across these different domains. And so, in many cases, we work in areas where they've operated for years without incorporating teamwork training. So this is especially exciting for us to be a part of IWISH, where there's an emphasis on teamwork from the outset. And so Debbie and I will be tag teaming presenting this material. And so I'm going to pass the baton to her first, and she's going to get us started.
All right, great. So next slide, please. All right, so the word team and teamwork is thrown around a lot in work environments. But sometimes when we refer to a collection of people as a team, they may not actually necessarily be working as a team. So the distinction between a group and a team may seem trivial, but there are big differences in the way that they function. So if we pick it apart a little bit, a team must have a shared goal in common. This doesn't mean that team members can't have individual goals, but what it does mean is that their individual goals do not interfere with the team goals. In a group, there is likely no shared goal. Each is driven by individual goals, even though there still can be a combined outcome. It just isn't achieved through shared goals and interdependence. And oftentimes, it isn't as easy to identify when a collection of people isn't a team. So this isn't necessarily an obvious thing. Members of a team are dependent on each other. There's an issue of interdependence. There's an aspect of reciprocity in how you conduct your work. So this interdependence is coordinated so to minimize duplication. Teams also have internal autonomy. So they develop, they manage, and revise their internal processes. So an example, this may look like what you may do, which is developing community partnerships and collaborating with community partners to create greater efficiency in delivery of care and well-being. So you may get tips for who to partner with, but this is largely an autonomous process where you and your wellness nurse or resident wellness director partner will decide who to partner with. And then teams operate within the context of a social system. If you aren't communicating, you aren't a team, you're working alone. Teamwork is truly represented by interaction. Next slide. So as we go through these slides, we want you to think about your current team. And if you haven't had a lot of experience working within that team, think about past teams. We think that those teams that you have in mind will help to contextualize the concepts we're talking about. So the first distinction that we want to make is the difference between what is called taskwork and teamwork. Taskwork is what the team is engaged in. So for example, it may represent enrolling residents and assisting them in accomplishing their goals set in their healthy aging plan. Teamwork, however, is the how that gets done. How do you coordinate task work with your teammates? The ways in which you support your team members. The meetings that you have or any interactions you have with your team members represent the teamwork part of your role. And we'll come back to this distinction in a few slides, and throughout this webinar, think about that distinction. It's typically easier to measure or even talk about your task work performance than it is to talk about your teamwork performance. But the two should not be used interchangeably in measuring the effectiveness of a team. Next slide. So we all have many years of experience working in teams, but not many of us actually receive education around the concept of teamwork. And I'm not sure how many of you are aware, but there are large parts of disciplines that actually study teamwork. So in an effort to provide you some of the highlights of what is meant by the term teamwork and what's in the science of teamwork, we want to present a heuristic known as the 7 C's of teamwork. And this heuristic was developed by a group of organizational psychologists to help break down the types of behaviors that predict effective teamwork. So we want to define those 7 C's. And each of these 7 C's can be considered large buckets, very large buckets that can be unpacked into much smaller concepts. But for now, we want to keep our focus at the big bucket level. The communication is the process of sending and receiving information. But not, that forms and reforms a team's attitudes, behaviors, and cognition. So when we say attitudes, think about how you're motivated to work in your team. Is the sharing of information often lacking, which then makes you feel in the dark, which then influences how you're motivated to work with that team. Coordination represents the mechanisms like things like team huddles and debriefs that may help to self-correct when a team veers off track. Cooperation is the motivational driver of teamwork. It's the attitudes, beliefs, and feelings of the team that drive behavioral action. So if you think about it from that collective attitude that you can accomplish something as a team, or that identity that you have for being a part of the IWISH program or your specific IWISH team. Another C, which means refers to cognition, refers to what happens in your mind. It's about shared understanding, knowing the roles and responsibilities of the team, your team objectives and norms, but also knowing that those on your team actually share those same objectives and norms. It's about clearly defined roles and having those shared goals. Coaching is about leadership, but not necessarily establishing one person as the leader, but instead a shared process whereby expectations are set, team goals are established, and setting the direction toward accomplishing these goals. And depending on the context, different team members may actually take on this role of coach or leader at different times. Conflict is the perceived incompatibilities in the interests, beliefs, or views held by one or more team members. And we'll talk a little bit more about conflict later. And then the last C, which refers to conditions, refers to the where in terms of where you do the work. It refers to the context, the culture, the composition of your team. And we're going to use the 7 C's to frame our discussion for the rest of the webinar. And you'll see for each concept we introduce, you'll see one or more of the icons in the bottom left side of the slide. And this will help to illustrate how what we talk about sometimes fits neatly into one of these categories. But you'll often see that it actually fits into several of these C's. Next slide, please. So we've identified that the work we can do can be defined as task work or teamwork. And we describe that heuristic of the 7 C's. But another way to conceptualize teamwork is as a process over time. And teamwork is dynamic and evolving. And it doesn't last for only an hour, it lasts all year round. So as a team, you will shift between episodes of what can be considered transition phases. If you think about a transition phase as that planning that you do as a team, or when you reevaluate goals or reevaluate what you just did or accomplished. It's the strategizing part. And that all leads to the phases of action, or your action processes, which represents the coordination of team members, providing support, monitoring progress of your goal. And then there's this third phase called, that we can conceptualize, which is called the interpersonal phase. So as I mentioned before, teamwork is interactions between people. So when you consider interpersonal processes, this might refer to any conflict management that you might have to engage in, the development of trust, or even just the communications that you have with team members. Next slide, please. The reason we've taken the last few minutes defining what teamwork is because oftentimes teamwork is referred to as a global concept. Oh, we failed at teamwork. But the information we've provided here will help you to define and to potentially identify where the true breaks in teamwork occur. So your team can be reaching your goals and even exceeding your team's productivity or performance goals. However, a dysfunctional team can still also reach their task and performance goals. If you think about the outcomes of your team, think beyond that final number of residents enrolled or the goals that you've met. An effective team grows, they learn, they develop their processes to get the most out of each other's different skills and knowledge. They are cohesive, they enjoy working together, and these are the baseline concepts of what defines a team, an effective team. So as we dig deeper into interprofessionalism, communication and feedback, all these concepts that we just mentioned will continue to emerge. Next slide. So now that we've had a chance to lay out the framework for effective teamwork, tell us which of the 7 C's you think is the most important. And remember, there is no right or wrong answer, but we want to hear from you in terms of what you think. And this will be the first time that we're seeing the poll, so Joy, will we see results?
Yes, there will be results.
Okay, great. In this heuristic, when we presented it in other domains, has, I think, really resonated because, again, they are the big buckets, and for each C, we could spend hours talking about each of those and unpacking it further. So we really do hope that that this means something to you. And
so Debbie, if you're interested, so we were able to get about 83 participants, the number 1 C was communication. And some people are typing their response into chat, but it seems communication is the one that most people think is important. People also feel the cooperation is important.
Mm-hmm. And that's very typical. I mean, communication is a huge part of how individuals interact, right? We've talked about how teamwork is interaction. But we do want to emphasize that communication is, again, the big, broad bucket. There are other many things that are very critical to developing effective communication, like trust, understanding what your role is, understanding what others' roles are. So it's beyond, it's so much bigger than just that one word. So, but it's very common to hear communication as being the most important.
And I think if I can just add a little bit here, just one more point. One of the C's that typically is not responded to as the most important, but in some ways is absolutely the most important, is conditions. If the conditions aren't right in your work environment, if you don't have the support for teamwork, then none of the other things can fall into place. Communication can't fall into place. Coordination can't fall into place. So even though conditions is usually the last one that's thought about, that one in many ways can be absolutely critical.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right, so we'll move on to the next slide, please. So just to take a minute to reflect, which of the 7 C's will you practice this week? And also, which of the 7 C's do you have most difficulty with? What will you do to become more comfortable with that specific big bucket, that C?
As a reminder, be sure to select all participants when chatting in your response. I see conflict appearing often and cooperation. We're going to move on just because we do have a lot of information to cover, but please keep chatting into the chat box, and we'll be communicating with you via chat as the presentation progresses. Debbie, back to you.
Great. And I'm going to pass the baton back to Mike so we can continue the next section.
So now that we've laid the foundation for teamwork, let's talk a little bit more about practice and specifically cultivating interprofessional skills within the IWISH program. IWISH is contingent on successful interprofessional behavior. A key from this is to remember that each member of the team is bringing a separate set of knowledge, a separate set of skills, and separate attitudes to the table. Next slide. So if I were to ask you who is on your team, I'd be willing to bet that you'd name your wellness nurse or resident wellness director partner. Some of you may even already consider the resident as part of your team. These are both accurate, and both of these individuals are obviously indispensable to what your objectives are. But the reality is that you're part of a larger team, or more accurately, a system of teams. So your core team is only one team in the system, where other teams such as community partners that you'll be reaching out to or healthcare partners will help define this larger system. So you may find that your core team may sometimes serve as a bridge between some of these other teams as well, like between care partners and community partners. And as a member, you are a core of this network of interprofessional teams. So each partner or team member is bringing this different skill set, this different background, this different viewpoint toward the team. And each team member has individual goals, but remember the true team is working towards an overall goal as well, or promoting positive change for residents through healthy action plans and community resources and support. So for the next 3 slides, we're going to highlight 3 key concepts that are central to effective interprofessional work. And while these aren't the only concepts of interprofessionalism, these are 3 that we feel are most important to effective interprofessional communication. Next slide. So when working interprofessionally, developing common ground is important. Common ground is about shared understanding. When working in a team, it is important to understand the following 2 things. 1, every team member has a different perspective. So 2 wellness nurses may have 2 very different perspectives on things, even though their trainings may be similar. The second point is that there are typically areas where team members' understanding overlaps. This is what is known as common ground. So effective teams typically have more overlap or common ground about team tasks and goals. If there is a lack of common ground, team members may seem out of sync, or they might do stuff incorrectly, or even there may just be general inefficiency in the way that the team operates. So think about when you started your current role. Did you find yourself in a situation where there was no overlap in task understanding? Where knowing what you know now, you would have benefited from some additional perspective early on. If things are communicated effectively, it typically promotes common ground. The more common ground you share, the more quickly the team can respond to any emerging situations that require immediate action. If there's no common ground, teams will probably spend more time sharing information than acting. And this is, again, where the inefficiencies may occur. So is common ground developed immediately? Absolutely not. It's developed over time. You have to think about it as a developing process. So you may find yourself communicating more early on, but as you start to develop this common ground, then you may require less information sharing than understanding how your team is going to act. It's kind of like a shared brain. The one thing to caution as far as common ground is to not be over-dependent on experts. You won't all have the same skills. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't be understanding what other team members have. And so if there's an instance where there's someone that is always the go-to for a specific task, becoming over-reliant on that team member can become detrimental when that team member is either unavailable or if someone even leaves the team, then you have to adapt to that. Next slide. So assisting with health and social support needs, it's not suited for lone wolves. Every now and then we all need support, and it's not uncommon for teams to face periods where workload is not evenly distributed. Sometimes one team member may feel like they're swimming against the current while the other is not. And what effective teams engage in is what is known as backup behavior to combat these periods. So you should not rely on team members to always speak up when they need help, though. That's not always an intuitive response for someone who feels like they're swimming against the current. So team members engaged in backup behavior are monitoring the actions of the rest of the team the way that they are, that way they're better equipped to offer support when it's needed. And so this becomes exponentially easier if there's a clear understanding of roles and responsibilities on the team. This is where the benefits of developing common ground is most evident. And when there's ongoing communication and a culture of expressing gratitude for support is established, the team members are just better equipped to jump in and support as needed. It's important when talking about backup behavior to realize that it has to be a mutual support. So it's not just that you are willing to offer support to other people, but it's also that you're willing to receive help, which, again, is surprisingly hard for some people to master, asking for support in situations when they feel like they should be keeping up, but they're not. So we provided some questions to help here to guide the assessment of whether backup behavior is necessary. You can use these as you can take these back and use these in situations where backup behavior may be appropriate. So when we think about backup behavior, it doesn't mean, I guess the final point on backup behavior is don't monitor your teammates' performance to the point to where you're failing to meet your own task responsibilities. It's a mutual condition in which you're still responsible for your own task work, but you're providing the backup behavior only as is necessary so it doesn't hinder the team. Next slide. Have you ever been in a meeting where you disagreed with what a person was saying, but you were uncertain how they would react if you voiced your disagreement? The concept of psychological safety is kind of ties into that. It's critical for members to be willing to share information, to contribute ideas, and be fully committed to the team. And so the absence of psychological safety may cause members to be overly cautious in their work, afraid of discussing mistakes, and they may experience increased levels of anxiety and stress. And so we've provided some ways to cultivate psychological safety in your team. Some of it is repetition from other slides, but it's important to repeat. Being clear what the expectations are within the team, knowing the roles and responsibilities, is arguably the most important thing to establish in a team. Without clear expectations, teams just aren't able to develop common ground, and thus backup behavior becomes more difficult to provide, and thus limits the amount of psychological safety that teams experience. In our experience, failure to understand roles and responsibilities is typically the biggest contributor to team dysfunction. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is to spend time understanding everyone's roles and responsibilities. Another way of developing psychological safety is through regular interaction. If you communicate frequently, you will feel more comfortable to share your viewpoint, even if it's in a disagreement. Demonstration of appreciation. Acknowledge when your team members are doing things well or helping you. This is going to come up again later. Recognizing work well done is a powerful way to cultivate a safe interprofessional environment. Backup behavior. That was a concept so important that it merited its own slide, just the previous slide. Again, that's backup behavior is critical for team performance. And don't just say you're open-minded. Show it. Don't shoot down ideas. Explore ideas. There's an improv game that I can think of. It's called the yes and game, where the rules are, whatever your partner says, you agree and extend the thought by adding to it. The rationale of the game is that an instant disagreement shuts down the communication, and in improv that'll lose your audience pretty quickly. Similar principles are in play in team communication. Automatically shutting down ideas is a surefire way to have team members retract from the team. Doesn't mean that all ideas are good or winners, but keeping an open mind will help to promote creative thought. And the final is demonstrate humor. And it's important to differentiate between laughing at and laughing with your team members. If you're able to laugh with your team members, you are cultivating a positive team culture. Next slide. So now we've covered ways to cultivate interprofessional skills. Tell us about a time. Have you ever been on a team where you wanted to say something but were afraid to speak up? And what did you do? I think this can be a challenge. I think a lot of people can relate to this because there's certain stress that comes with speaking your mind in an uncomfortable situation.
Hi, Michael. This is Joy. So I won't go through all of them, but people are sharing. And some people are saying that they did feel bad for not speaking up. Some people didn't speak up because they thought that it would upset the balance of the goal or the team dynamics. Somebody did say that they felt that it was the right choice not to say something. And some people say they just kind of balance it out, think about when it is necessary to speak up and when it is not necessary to speak up. And some people say that they wait to see if somebody else will say what they're thinking.
Sure.
We'll keep communicating via group chat, but I'll turn it back over to you and Debbie.
Okay. Well, I think it's interesting that to mention that the one respondent said that they didn't feel like it was the right situation. I think there is a balance there where you want to make sure you're speaking up in the right instance, but part of having psychological safety is in feeling free to where ideas are openly exchanged. And so I would encourage that sharing behavior, that instance of sharing behavior. Next slide, please. So take a minute to think about how you will cultivate your interprofessional skills in the next few weeks.
All right, so now we're going to switch to workplace communication. And as we heard from you all in terms of the poll about the 7 Ps, communication is typically singled out as the most important aspect of team behavior. And in the IWISH context, you will be interacting with a wide variety of individuals, all of whom require different considerations of how best to interact. So you're going to probably be having to change the way you interact depending on who you are speaking to. And it's a large onion, as I mentioned before, it's a large onion that has many layers. But we'll dive in a little bit into communication. Next slide. And I actually love this image because I think it's so true. In this age of mobile devices and technology, social media, good communication isn't always easy to pin down. It's also about complex, work dynamics and problems. There are no necessarily published statistics on how communication impacts the effectiveness of aging services. However, in one context, particularly in healthcare, we do know that poor communication is the primary cause of medical errors. And again, we're using that big bucket word of communication. But medical errors is the 3rd leading cause of death in the U.S. And that's actually behind heart disease and cancer and just ahead of respiratory issues. So the point in bringing this up is not to obviously scare you, but to highlight the importance of communication. Even in highly specialized, highly trained environments, communication can be a source of error, and that isn't just common sense to fix it. Next slide. So communication is not just the transmission of content. There's a pattern to it. There's an exchange of information that can take place in a variety of modalities. So think about the ways that people communicate with you on a daily basis. You receive emails, text messages, phone calls. Sometimes you may have face-to-face verbal and nonverbal cues, webinars, for example. You get the point. There are numerous modes of communication, and each of them has advantages and disadvantages. So depending on the modality of communication, factors like tone become more important. So how many of you, just as a hypothetical, think about an email that you might have received from a coworker or a friend. Did you ever misread the intention of the message because the tone came across too aggressive or too demanding or rude? Would that message have been interpreted differently in a conversation if they would have picked up the phone? Possibly. The point is not to suggest all phone conversations and face-to-face interactions. That's not practical. But communication in the written and electronic format should not be taken for granted. And the lack of social and emotional cues make it easy to misread intentions in this format. So another consideration for effective workplace communication is in framing. Framing is all in how you say something. This is so especially true for the IWISH program, where a part of your core team is the resident. And research has shown that older adults are influenced heavily by the inclusion or exclusion of extraneous details. They are likely to make serious medical decisions based on how doctors frame the two options rather than the qualitative differences between the options. And this may cause older adults to inappropriately form their choices. And although the study focused on medical decisions, this is by no means limited to medical decision making. So the way you frame things impacts the way others respond to you. And then we also want to talk about feedback. And this is such a critical part, of course, of teamwork and workplace communication that we'll dedicate some slides later on in this webinar about it. So we'll talk more about that later. Next slide. Effective workplace communication is not just having one skill. Again, it's about unpacking that large onion. It's a collection of skills. And arguably the most important of these is active listening. Because without communication, you have to listen to be able to communicate. And hopefully, obviously, you're doing this right now. And it's not a passive activity. And in addition to closely paying attention to what others are saying, you should also be asking questions to clarify anything that is unclear in the message. So really making it meaningful to you. Listening, but also wondering what other information you might need to make it meaningful to you to take an action. We've already discussed the basis for communication skills on the previous slide. This is effectively communicating by taking into account the receiver, the message, the medium. thinking about social perceptiveness, being aware of others' reactions and understanding why they react the way that they did. Self-monitoring is being sensitive to the effects of our behaviors on others. Have you ever sent a late night text message to a coworker thinking about was it necessary to reach out in non-work hours? Do you have norms where this type of communication is acceptable and not a problem? In an emergency, this is likely met with appropriate reactions, no big deal. But if repeated on a nightly basis, this may become a source of frustration where that coworker might feel that you're infringing on their boundaries. It might create stress for that coworker. Another skill is altruism, and do good for others without the expectation of feedback. And then, as mentioned on the following slide, adopting a tone of warmth, positivity, and cooperation will go far. How well do you accept criticism? How do you deal with frustration? Practicing patience and tolerance in these situations can reduce unnecessary conflict. And some people are better at these than others, but these skills can be practiced and developed, and you can identify one that you might want to focus on and then practice it, and understanding that they are important can be a critical first step. And some people underestimate the importance of these in relation to technical skills on their job and need to be reminded of the detrimental effect that they can have if they aren't developed. Next slide. So your operations manuals provide guidance for how to specifically approach communication with the different members of the team. And we won't discuss them all here, but it's important to consider these as you think about the different ways you communicate. For communication with residents, 2 points to emphasize are to allay fears. If the resident is not comfortable, nothing else matters. You won't get the results you're looking for. And this is where that list of communication skills from the previous slide comes into play. Conveying a warm, positive attitude can help to present yourself in a non-threatening tone. Beyond that, you'll need to be perceptive to how residents react when you interact with them. If you notice that a resident is showing more preference for interacting with a specific team member, be adaptable. And the other point here is to remember that you can't fix everything in one visit. Pace your interactions. Otherwise, you may overwhelm the resident and even burn yourself out trying to do too much at once. Next slide. The Wellness Nurse and Resident Wellness Director partnership is predicated on frequent communication. So you will be meeting weekly. You're going to be communicating daily. Make that your mantra if you have to. When talking about communication, we mostly think about verbal communication. But remember the different modalities. Written communication is very much an integral part of information exchange. And we already alluded to that lack of social and emotional cues in electronic communication. And I'm not going to belabor that point, but you will also be communicating through documentation of resident visits. And we've seen this across care settings. When documenting, we tend to fall into the habit of information dumping. Put everything in there and let someone else make sense of it later. This does two things to disrupt the flow of information within a team. It floods the documentation process with unnecessary or redundant information, and it overloads the information retriever, making it difficult to pull out the useful information from the norm. So what can be done? Besides being mindful of how you are documenting, minimize technical jargon. Use concise, easy to understand language. This will make it easier to find the information that's needed and promote efficient information processing on the receiving end of documentation. Next slide. So lastly, remember you're part of an interprofessional network of teams. The way you communicate with property management and community partners should also be done thoughtfully. IWISH is a new program. Don't assume that property management has all the answers you're seeking out, but they may have some of them. So it's safe to assume that they are figuring things out just like you. This is where your interactions with them can promote common ground, and you can learn and grow together as you find best practices for resident engagement and beyond. Next slide. All right, so we're on to another poll, and we're running a bit long, but we'll go through the poll. So what mode of communication do you prefer? And specifically at work, what would you prefer to do? And this could very well differ based on a situation or the context. And oftentimes it's contingent on the time that you have, the person that you might be communicating with. But I think understanding what that preferred mode of communication and even conveying that to your team members could help to build some effective teamwork.
So hopefully you all see the poll question on the right-hand side of the screen, and this poll will be open longer. I know that last one was a little quick. So as Debbie said, please let us know what mode of communication you prefer: written, computer, smartphone, or conversation. And if you're having trouble use the poll, you're definitely welcome to use the chat function. All right, our poll has closed, and we're getting ready to see the results. One moment. Okay. So our winner for preferred mode is conversation. Most people like to talk via conversation. Back to you, Debbie and Mike.
Great, thank you. All right, and just to move on, I think that's great. I think having that conversation does help to minimize some of the problems with ineffective communication. So that's great. So now let's just take a quick minute to reflect on when for those that said conversation was their preferred one, might it be that written or texting is something that you don't necessarily enjoy, and might maybe think about what you will be doing in the next few weeks to improve that. And then what excites you about refining this mode of communication? And I'm going to pass it back over to Mike.
Okay, next slide, please. So all teams experience conflict, and you cannot with 100% certainty avoid conflict. So over the course of the next couple of slides, we're gonna look at forms of conflict and also how people react to conflict, and then provide some suggestions for how you might consider resolving conflict when it does arise. So conflict manifests in many different ways, and that commercial is a humorous example, and we'll see in a minute how passive-aggressive behavior can impact the team and conflict management. But it's important to differentiate the parts of teamwork first, so that you can understand that there's not just one type of conflict, and that just because your team isn't fighting doesn't mean that everything is okay. So the three types of conflict, the first is task conflict. And this type of conflict may manifest itself as a disagreement about the work that is being done in the group. And actually, this can be a good type of conflict. This is a type of conflict where if the way that a task is being performed is inefficient and there's disagreement over it, that when you come together to manage this conflict, that you may come up with more creativity or a creative response to this. So think about task conflict as engaging in this divergent thinking and thinking towards creative solutions. Relationship conflict, on the other hand, tends to be a little more negatively related to team effectiveness. And this is the type of conflict that most people think of. It manifests itself through disagreements about personal and social issues related to work. This may stem from other types of conflict that spill over into personal conflict, and so this can be detrimental to the team. The third type of conflict is process conflict, and so these are disagreements about the assignments of duties and resources, and it represents how well groups are managing different types of coordination activities. So decisions about how to manage the logistical accomplishments of the task, and decisions about how to coordinate people in accomplishing a task. So what we know about conflict for sure is that it does influence team performance, team satisfaction, It influences the desire for people to want to work with each other in the future, and there's many other team-level variables that come into play for this. Recent research has revealed that there's more complex relationships among the process, task, and relationship conflicts, suggesting that it may be important to consider when each type of conflict occurs, and most importantly, how you can resolve it. So the main takeaway is that conflict will happen. It's important to address it, resolve it, and recover from it. And there are some causes for conflict. I won't go through an exhaustive list of them, but at the top of the list is a lack of clarity, lack of mutual understanding of roles. We've mentioned that earlier, and I want to emphasize that again. Understanding roles is critical to effective team performance, even in a conflict situation. Next slide. So knowing that the type of conflict is helpful, but it's where team members react to conflict is where the sparks actually start to fly, so to speak. So if you look at this matrix, we have the 4 different common types of conflict reaction. So on one hand, you have passive reaction. These are people that do nothing. They'll pretend that the problem does not exist, or brush it under the rug, or let it go. What happens, or what tends to happen, is that emotions start to get bottled up. And over the long term, this can have detrimental effects because you get the simmering frustrations which build up until they will overflow inappropriately at whatever the task, the trigger task or conflict at hand is that triggers the overflow of emotion. At the other end of the spectrum is an aggressive way of reacting to conflict. Unlike the passive counterparts, these individuals seek out conflict. They may attack other team members. Their intention may even be to hurt them, typically emotionally. In extreme cases, possibly even physically. These are aggressive responses like, "You're incompetent. You've wasted a whole week's work for me." These statements leave lasting issues of resentment and pain, and it's really difficult for a team to recover from aggressive behavior. The third goes back to the FedEx commercial, which again was a humorous depiction of passive aggressiveness, but in some ways, passive aggressiveness is possibly the most destructive response reaction strategy. It combines with the worst parts of being passive and the worst parts of being aggressive. You avoid the situation in an aggressive way. So you give someone the cold shoulder or the silent treatment, and it really leaves no opportunity for solving problems. Things will continue to fester, and this will undermine the climate of the whole team. And so of these 4 responses, really the one that we advocate for is being assertive. This means communicating directly, not emotionally, not personally, but just communicating how you feel about a situation, what you felt the appropriate changes that are necessary to address the conflict. An example response in using an assertive tone is to say, "I feel really upset because I relied on you to make sure this information was posted on time, and I feel upset all my hard work of the week seems wasted." So this response makes use of what we know as an I statement, which is an effective form of communicating feedback. So a big part of the conflict reaction goes back to what Debbie mentioned about framing. The way you frame your reaction to conflict can have major implications for how the team resolves conflict. Next slide. So before moving on to the last part of the webinar today, I just wanted to very quickly review some strategies for managing conflict. If you find yourself having to resolve conflict in a team, you want to take these steps. You want to identify the self-interest of all stakeholders. When you know what the desired end goal is for each person, it's easier to identify how you might be able to reach an end goal that will satisfy the most number of people involved in the conflict. You identify these interests. You also should diffuse emotion. As hard as it may be, emotion can be poisonous for conflict resolution. When emotion is involved, it's very difficult to come to a solution. And so oftentimes resolving conflict means that there will have to be some kind of a compromise, develop multiple solutions, come up with more solutions, think about the non-negotiable parameters around the conflict, and find solutions that make compromises where possible around these parameters. And if you can do all of these things, then collectively your team will come out on the other end with future action plans for moving forward. Next slide. So we were gonna engage in group chat here, but I think since we're running behind on time, that we'll just move forward to cover the debrief section. That sounds appropriate.
Yes, Michael. Yeah. So participants, you all can continue to chat in the chat, but we are going to move ahead to the feedback and debrief section. And then we'll also, the second video we will send out has a link via email at the end of the day.
Great.
So back to you.
Thank you.
If you go to next slide. All right, so we're going to talk about feedback and debrief. Next slide. Next slide. All right. So an analysis of 46 separate studies of the effectiveness of debriefing found that performance increased by an average of 25% when debriefs were conducted. So remember that effective teams are constantly evolving, and doing a debrief actually plays a central role in this. So it provides a platform for learning from successes and from failures to improve processes and grow. So when you consider what it takes to conduct a debrief, then a debrief does not have to be time-consuming, and it isn't technically hard to do. We all have reactions to what you just engaged in as a team. Debriefs should actually be more common in the workplace, but they're unfortunately not. So if there is one thing you could consider implementing for sure, is to conduct debriefs with your team. Next slide. So debriefs is a powerful way to encourage learning. In actuality, debriefs are an example of active learning. Debriefing is an iterative process in which individuals engage in the process of reflection and planning for improvement of future performance activities. That is the key to a debrief. You not only reflect and engage in that conversation, but you plan for future performance activities. The elements of a debrief, as seen here on the slide, are to engage in active self-learning, as I mentioned, develop intent on future changes, provide a focus on specific events, and engaging in this process by utilizing multiple sources of information, which means using information from your teammates, the residents, other members of your other teams that you're involved in. And let's break it down just a little bit further. Reflection and self-explanation. That means looking back on what just occurred, assessing the consequences. If we also think about, if you think about what a debrief might look like, it begins with a process with an appropriate introduction to the issue, framing of the debrief piece, state that purpose, reflect and discuss, ask questions, ensure that everyone in the team in the debrief is actually participating, and then also include ample time to clarify lessons learned. And when engaging in debriefs, this leads to enhanced knowledge of your team process and the task, better awareness of gaps and understanding, and clearer intent to what your role on the team and where your team is headed. Next slide. So feedback, although very different than the actual process of doing a debrief, is a part of the debrief. So we just want to touch on the fact that feedback should be specific, timely, honest, and actionable. All four things, not just one of these four things, but all these four things. So it may seem unnatural to be honest when you want to convey information about performance or processes that weren't effective. However, when you have the intent to enhance learning, motivation, and performance, it can actually become less awkward to provide and even receive feedback. So feedback should be specific. It should be addressing specific observable behaviors instead of making broad judgments. And emphasize specific behaviors that worked, so that team members are provided with that appraisal and then they know what they can repeat or should repeat. But then also discuss behaviors that didn't work so team members can learn and know what to change. So an example of good versus bad, I just observed you walk past a resident who clearly looked lost versus you're insensitive to residents' needs. So the difference is that specificity. It should be timely. It should be provided as soon as possible after the behavior was observed. It should be honest. It might feel easier to give only positive feedback, but constructive feedback is also helpful to the team. And it should be actionable. Again, providing something so that you can improve for the next time. Next slide. So we want to quickly outline some techniques for giving effective feedback. Very important is to listen. When receiving feedback, don't interrupt. And if the feedback isn't specific, ask for those specific requests. When giving feedback, frame it in terms of an I statement. Mike already referred to that, as opposed to you statement. Separate what matters and what gets in the way. It's that emotion. Separate that emotion. Give both positive and critical feedback. So literature on feedback has indicated that a ratio for positive and critical feedback is 5-to-1. You don't have to keep track of those numbers, but keeping that ratio in mind will help you hone your feedback giving skills. When giving or receiving feedback, be open to admitting when you're wrong. Perhaps I didn't observe everything when I provided the feedback, so now I need to reassess the feedback that I provided. Or maybe I received some feedback that now made me realize where my actions actually hurt my colleagues' work for that day or that week. And something that you might have heard of is something called the feedback sandwich. And that's when you state something positive, give a critique, and then close with a positive one. We would say to avoid the feedback sandwich. This is a popular technique for softening the sting of criticism, but it's found actually to devalue, praise, and obscure the problem from the recipient of the feedback. Next slide. So one technique that we would highly encourage you to use is something called Advocacy Inquiry. And it combines this issue of advocacy, which is represented as an observation by making a statement, and it integrates the use of I statements, and it combines it with inquiry, which then asks a question. So what does it look like? It's not saying you messed up. It's not saying what do you think you could have done better, but it's rather saying I noticed X. I was concerned about that because of Y, and I wonder how you saw it. So it helps to open that conversation and reflection. Next slide. So now, real quickly, suggestions for effective debrief. Focus on the task work, but the teamwork. Much easier to focus on task work because that's where your expertise lies. Focus on the teamwork. Involve all team members. Make sure that everyone participates. Provide some structure and understanding provide some structure in how you're doing the debrief. Make sure the outcomes include an agreement about future actions. Allocate ample time, but again, you don't have to have it be a long debrief. If it requires more time to give attention to some of the issues, make that a separate meeting. And then obviously focus on the developmental rather than any judgmental or evaluative issues. And then next slide, which is our last slide. So we've covered a lot of material, and the big question is, how do you make a good team great? Good teamwork is more than just task output, remembering the 7 C's, teamwork versus task work, and the different phases of teamwork. Know the roles and responsibilities of all your team members. It helps with clarity. Effective communication is as much about listening as it is about speaking. If conflict is managed well, it can be good for the team. And debrief and feedback are essential to growth as a team. That was a bit of a whirlwind, those last few slides, but that was the last piece of the content that we had. So the next slide is another one of the chat sessions, which we might, I guess, skip through.
I'm going to going by. So while you all are entering in your chat responses and sharing your experiences of giving and receiving feedback, I'm going to quickly go through the next steps, Debbie and Michael, if that's okay, to get us through to the end.
That'd be perfect.
And so Practice, practice, practice. This is one of several of our in-person training sessions that we've had. And as a reminder, we will go further in depth on these topics such as teamwork and resident engagement during the in-person. But it really will be helpful for you all to prepare for the in-person, prepare for interacting with residents if you begin to practice these concepts now. So take some time to practice the 7 C's of teamwork with either your resident wellness director, your wellness nurse, or other staff members that may be on site.